Hello and welcome to Fiction Fans, a podcast where we read books and short stories too. I'm Lily.
And I'm Sarah, and today we will be discussing Of Shadows, Stars, and Sabers, an anthology edited by Jendia Gammon and Gareth L. Powell.
But before we get into that conversation, we have our quick 5-minute intro questions, starting with, Sarah, what is something great that happened recently?
It's raining.
There you go, short and sweet, it's good.
It is good.
I donated blood this week. That's my good thing.
It's an excellent thing to do.
Yeah. It's a bummer because I react very well to donating blood. Like, I never get woozy or feel bad afterwards or anything. And my blood is, like, the least needed blood type. So it's always kind of like, well, better than nothing, right?
It is better than nothing. It's still a good thing to do.
You can have it. I'm not using it. But that's the goopy talk starting early. There's going to be a little bit more from this anthology. But what are you drinking tonight?
I am drinking wine. Box wine.
Delightful. I have bubbly pomegranate juice, which tastes good, but is far too cold. So if you hear teeth clattering in the background of this recording, my bad.
Why are you drinking something cold if it is too cold?
Because I didn't want to delay the recording by 5 minutes to wait for tea to steep and then cool down.
I suppose that's very considerate of you.
Considering I already pushed it back.
It's true.
And have you read anything good lately?
I have been continuing to read my collection of essays by Verlyn Flieger on various aspects of Tolkien.
Delightful. I have not been reading much except for this anthology, so it's a good thing we're going to talk about it at length right now.
It is, but before we start talking about the anthology, because this is an anthology of short stories, we're not going to do a spoiler section. It's really hard to have a spoiler section for short stories.
Yeah.
So we're just not.
I think, for the most part, our conversation will not be around if there is a twist ending for a story, because some of them do. We will try not to spoil it, and we will also try not to tell you which ones those are, because that in and of itself is kind of a spoiler.
Yes.
But we're going to be talking about these stories just from a general standpoint, and not, maybe not get in as deep into the nitty-gritty as we might otherwise. So from the introduction, it looks like this is the very first publication from a new indie pub.
Yes, it is. So Jendia Gammon and Gareth Powell have started a new publisher, or a new imprint, which is Stars and Sabers Publishing? Yes, Stars and Sabers. And this is their first book that they've put out, but it's not their last. They have a whole lineup that they've announced of some really interesting sounding books.
And at the back of the book, they thank some of their supporters, so it looks like this was also a little bit crowdfunded, which is pretty neat.
Yeah.
It's cool. I really like seeing all of the different approaches to publishing. I feel like things are getting a little bit more varied.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I really hope that their imprint does well, just because the world can use more publishers.
Yeah, variety is always a good thing, right?
Yes. And I did really enjoy this anthology overall. I would say, as expected, there are some stories that I quite liked, and some stories that didn't work for me as well. But that's just really what you get when you have a bunch of different pieces.
And so I assume you loved the story about a lady pulling all of her skin off piece by piece. That just really struck me as a Sarah story.
And that story I found very interesting. It was not my favorite, but it also was not my least favorite.
It reminded me, not in the actual story itself, but just kind of in those visuals. These Dark Abodes by Lindsay Manousos?
From These Dark Abodes, I believe.
Did I get her name right?
You did get her name right.
Hell yeah, I'm counting that. That's a win. So it reminded me a lot of that, just because I remember we had a whole conversation about why it didn't gross you out. Because it's also people removing skin, but in From These Dark Abodes, they remove all of their skin to become bones. Whereas in this short story, the character is removing her skin to become gooey.
I will say that I think that this short story was, goopier. and that made it a little less enjoyable for me.
Not for you.
Yes, it was still a good story. It just was not a story for me.
I would agree with that, though. Overall, this collection is what I think they said speculative fiction, but isn't that just like a way of saying science fiction / fantasy without saying science fiction / fantasy?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Just making sure I understood that marketing speak.
Yes. So this is like you say themed around just speculative fiction in general. So it's not a very granular theme, and you get a wide variety of stories from science fiction to fantasy to some horror. It's kind of runs the gamut.
And it did feel like there were a lot of different. We've used the word variety a lot, and I'm trying to come up with a different. There is a huge range of stories happening here, and not just in genre, but also like there were some stories that played with perspective in a really fun way, some that kind of bounced around with tenses. Stark Holborn has a short story in here, and you know that one fucks around with the timeline. So it was really fun. I actually had a hard time. I had to sit down and read this book, right? Because we're reading it for the podcast. I think I would have liked it a lot better if I had been reading it one story at a time and had like a good gap in between them. I found that a lot of them had similar enough imagery, especially because of the way that they were organized.
Yeah, I mean, they were kind of grouped thematically a little bit.
Yeah.
So you had very similar stories together.
And so going from one story to the next that was similar in that way, but so different in many others, I found myself having to like really stop and reorient myself. And I basically, for each story, had to read the first page 2 or 3 times before I could be like, okay, I am now in the mindset of this one and I can keep going. Because I was keeping like shit in my head from the previous story, which was just really unhelpful.
I don't know if I had that problem. I did like the way that they were thematically grouped. I found that was helpful for me as a reader. Probably would have benefited from a little additional time between each story, but that's the nature of reading a book a week.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not a lot of extra time.
I liked them being grouped that way. It just made me needing a gap very apparent. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Although I will say there were 2 stories like back to back about religious wars. And that felt like they could have been in different parts of that section, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to disagree there.
Yeah. Otherwise, yes, I liked having the sections as they were. I will say, at first, in my head, when I saw the first section of the shadows, I was like, oh, okay, great. The 3 sections in this book are going to be the shadows, the stars, and the sabers. That was not it.
That was not the case. But I had that same thought, to be honest.
There's actually 5 sections of the shadows, to the moon and stars, an earth so strange, by the saber and the spell, and toward the light. And it felt like there were a lot of bummers. Not in the like, I disliked the story way, but in a, the tone.
Yeah, I mean, there were plenty of happy stories too, but there were some bummers.
Maybe they just stuck out to me more. Maybe that says more about me than the collection.
And to be clear, I don't think that calling something a bummer means that's not us saying it was bad.
Yes, I can clarify again. I mean, a lot of these were very, thoughtful and conceptual about ideas that are not super happy. And that's still important to explore. And in fact, I love bummers, so not at all a complaint. Just something that I noticed as I was going through. And I think it made even the ones that have like an ostensibly happy ending is still like there were still some oofs in there.
For some of them. I mean, there were also just genuinely happy stories.
There were some, yes. Yes.
But I would agree there were a lot of bummers in that sense. I do wish that there had been more content warnings for the stories. We got content warnings on Ai Jiang's story, which is the final story in the collection, which I really appreciated. But there were some stories, particularly in the beginning, that had a lot of pretty dark content
And goopy.
And goopy. And as I've said, I'm not a horror reader. I kind of need to brace myself. And I did not get that opportunity. So I would have liked more content warnings.
Yeah, definitely. I did notice, and this is entirely arbitrary, but I thought it was fun. There were multiple Star Trek references in this collection.
There were some Star Trek references, it's true.
Far apart, not in any related way whatsoever, which makes it more interesting.
I mean, Star Trek is a cultural phenomenon.
It is. And I'm cheating a little bit because one of them was in Alice Street by Paul Cornell, which is formatted as a Wikipedia article about an ostensibly real actress. I have not actually looked it up. I don't think she is a real person. But
I don't think she is, but I did have that question about that article too. Because it's such a real life Wikipedia article.
And all of the media that she is related to in the article is real, or at least a lot of it was. So that's one of the places where Star Trek appeared, and so that's kind of cheating because there's just a lot of literal references, like encyclopedia references to other like cultural works. So it's kind of a gimme. But it counts. 2 Star Trek references.
I think that story also had a Doctor Who reference, although I'm not entirely sure.
Nice, because Cornell was a writer, right?
Yes, Cornell has written for Doctor Who, specifically.
Yeah. Well, that does, I think, make him count for authors whose work we've read before, although I guess we didn't technically read it. I didn't technically read it.
You have, I mean, I have read Rosebud, which is a novella that he wrote.
Right.
That has nothing to do with Doctor Who.
But if we're counting his Doctor Who episodes, then he counts.
We have seen his Doctor Who episodes.
We have encountered his work. But it was really fun. Ai Jiang, like you mentioned, we interviewed her, a number of years ago, and time is meaningless, so I have no idea how long ago that was. Was that just 2 years ago?
2023, maybe, yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, Con Wong, Stark Holborn, whose Factus series I love so much.
We've had Peter McLean onto the podcast, although not actually to talk about his books. We talked about whiskey and publishing.
And that's why he wasn't in the list of authors I've read before.
It was interesting, though.
Wait, did I miss anybody?
I've read Adrian Tchaikovsky, and I might have listened to something by Elizabeth Miles because she's done a lot of work for Big Finish and the Blake Seven and Doctor Who audio adventures.
Neat. I haven't read any Tchaikovsky. Well, I guess I have now. Ha!
You have now.
So, the Stark Holborn piece, Last Gasp, I'm actually so torn on because I loved it. I love all of Holborn's work that we've read, like, so much. Absolutely one of my favorite series that we've done for the podcast, possibly at all, like, all time. But I feel like I would not have engaged with the short story in this collection as well if I hadn't read Tenlo and those books. And that makes me hesitant to say it's one of my favorites in the collection.
I agree. I really enjoyed it, but I did feel like I needed some background. I felt like that about another story too, actually. There were a couple of stories in here that I know for a fact were related to previous works, other published works by authors. For example, The Magic Wood by Jonathan L. Howard featured a character from his Johannes the Necromancer book, I believe. And Hunger and the Lady by Peter McLean was also specifically related to his series. And I believe The Asexual Succubus by John Wisewell was a sequel to a short story or a novella or something that he had published. And some of those I felt stood on their own, and others I felt probably would have benefited from having more context for the series, like The Last Gasp, and also, to a lesser extent, Hunger and the Lady.
That's interesting because I felt like Hunger and the Lady held up until it got to the end, and there was like an end plate about how this was the first time these two characters met and it was so momentous. And that kind of threw me out of it.
Well, that's kind of what I mean.
Yeah, but I think without that end plate, it would have been fine.
Right, but without that end plate, it wouldn't necessarily, you wouldn't know that it was related to another series, which I guess
That's fine.
is fine.
Yeah,
is good.
That
yeah.
means it stands alone. Let it stand on its own 2 feet. Last Gasp, does it introduce itself as being? No, it does not. See, Last Gasp does not say anything.
Yeah, I think that you just kind of pick up by context clues.
Yeah. Or you're just a little bit lost and you don't know why.
Possibly. Also, I have to admit that I'm a terrible, terrible person, and I did just read it straight through. I did not actually play the game.
I also did. Although I kind of wish I would go back and like read the last. So it's kind of a choose your own adventure story, would you say?
I would say so, yeah.
So there's like a paragraph of things that happen, and then you're supposed to flip a coin, and heads or tails tells you like which paragraph to read next. And I read it straight through also, and it worked straight through. But I did go back and read like the leading in like couple of sentences before I read the next outcome.
I just read it straight through.
I needed to remind myself what was happening. I do wish I had the physical book. Is there there must be a physical version.
There is, yes.
I think it would have been a better reading experience for that story in particular if I had had the physical book.
I think for me, I just choose your own adventure books or stories don't work as a reading experience for me because I'm not going to flip to the right paragraph or the right page or whatever. Like that's just too much effort. I need like an app. I need to build myself an app.
I do think ebooks are like you can do some really cool stuff with choose your own adventure because of the multimedia aspect or like the being able to link back and forth. But I also think Last Gasp worked perfectly well reading it straight through.
Yeah, it was fine. I mean, I didn't have any problems with it.
Like it's not a genuine choose your own adventure in that way.
I mean, some of the scenarios do double up if you read them straight through.
Right. If you actually sit down and read a classic choose your own adventure, it does not flow at all.
That's true.
Because it completely is jumping around and you have to go to like completely different sections.
That's true. This one was more linear.
Yes. The Magic Wood by Jonathan L. Howard was very fun. It was probably one of my favorites in the collection, not just because we have read Carnegie Ghost Hunter.
Ghost Finder.
The Ghost Finder, excuse me. He's not hunting, he is finding.
He is finding them.
For our very first spooky month, maybe?
I think it was.
Yeah. So
I think that was when we were still doing 2 books an episode.
Ooh, what a mistake.
That was a terrible mistake. Why did we do that?
Seemed like a good idea at the time.
I mean, I know what our reasoning was. We were just wrong.
Yes. Anyway, but that was not the only reason why, and not necessary to enjoy the story, I don't think.
No, absolutely. You didn't need to read Carnacki. And I also don't think that you have to read the novel about Cabal either.
I didn't know that there was an accompanying novel. Like, that was completely news.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know which came first.
Okay.
Well, presumably the novel, because I think the novel was published a long time ago.
Yeah.
And I don't know chronologically where they stand. I've never read the novel. I think I own it, but have never gotten around to reading it.
Well, I loved The Magic Wood. I thought the tone was great. The characters were good. Information was introduced to us with like good pacing, which is really hard to do in a short story.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. And it was one of the stories that made me think, okay, I want to go and find out what else he has written. You know, what else can I read by him?
Yes, there were a couple of stories that I was like, I'm marking this down. I want to read more by this author. Including Unremarkable by Alice James, which was not necessarily my favorite story in and of itself, but it made me really want to read more of James's work.
Which is excellent because Alice James has written an excellent, excellent series, which is basically Sookie Stackhouse, but British.
Oh, fuck! That's Alice James?
That's Alice James!
Oh my god, okay.
Yes.
You have been telling me about that series for so long. I did not
Yes.
realize it was the same author. Okay.
Yes, it's the same author. I had no idea that she had contributed to this anthology, or she probably posted about it, and I just had forgotten. And so when I saw her name, I was like, yes!
Well, it got me. It reeled me in.
Well, I do have a series for you.
Excellent. I think possibly my hands down favorite, though, of the whole collection was Grey by Ren Hutchings.
I don't know if I would say my hands down favorite was Grey, because I really, really liked Holy Fools by Adrian Tchaikovsky. But Grey by Ren Hutchings was excellent.
Holy Fools was incredible. The religious war as a theme is just not going to be my thing.
True. I really liked the ending of Holy Fools.
It was incredible. I really liked the short story. I do want to read more Tchaikovsky / any. That's been on the list for a while, and we should do something in the podcast so that I actually have a chance to read it.
We really should.
Yeah, because
I keep saying that we're going to add Tchaikovsky to the podcast calendar, and just we never do.
Eventually.
This year. We'll make it happen this year.
Yes. And Holy Fools was less of a bummer than some of the other stories.
Still a bummer. Yeah. I would definitely count Holy Fools as a bummer. I mean, it wasn't gory and violent. Bummer.
No, but that's not what a bummer is. A bummer
that's not what a bummer is.
Is a little bit of a bummer. That's all.
But I would count this as a bummer.
Yeah. Whereas Grey by Ren Hutchings was not. I mean, it's contemplative and subdued, but I wouldn't say that it's a bummer.
No. It did leave me wanting more.
Yes.
But that doesn't make it a bummer.
Oh my god. The perspective switch is so masterfully executed.
That was so good. I wasn't surprised necessarily, but I wasn't expecting it to happen like that. Because I do feel like Hutchings leaves you hints in the story leading up to the perspective change. But just the way that it was done was excellent.
Oh, so good. And up until that point, the story really focused on like mundane everyday life on a like colony ship, basically. Not a ship. They're in orbit, currently terraforming the planet, I think.
Satellite.
Thank you. Science word. And I love that kind of close, mundane. And not mundane. Do you know what I mean, though? For the character, it was shitty everyday life.
Yeah. And this was definitely shitty everyday life.
Yeah, he was having a terrible birthday. Poor guy. But I love that kind of thing. Looking at the otherworldly and spectacular, but like, what does that look like for a regular person? That part was just also done really, really, really well.
It was just a good story.
It was really good. It was my favorite. I loved Last Gasp so much, but the fact that I think it's not as accessible is why it doesn't quite get my number one slot.
That's fair. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I still think that I would put Holy Fools above Grey if I was held at gunpoint and had to pick my favorites. But they're quite close. I also did really like An Asexual Succubus by John Wisewell, just because I love the premise. It's such a good premise.
It's right there on the tin. It was a really cute story, and I really liked learning about how Lily, the main character, which she spells her name differently, so I wasn't mad. She feeds off of just joy. I don't want to say more. So I don't want to. It's not really a spoiler. She's Ace. She's a succubus. What else she gonna do?
Yeah, I mean, It's right there on the tin.
Yeah. The descriptions of that were extremely sweet. And you're right, this was definitely one of the stories that was in no way a bummer whatsoever.
This was not a bummer at all, except maybe in the fact that her parents didn't understand that she was Ace and they
Well,
wanted her to take over the family business, but that's really not a main aspect of this story.
no. And like, I wouldn't call it cozy because of that, but that doesn't make it a bummer. It
No.
just makes it realistic.
Yeah. But it was so cute. I loved it.
I think this is really petty of me, but I think the title is a block for me to love it. It's just it's too straightforward. I'm sorry. Even if it was just like Lily's Day at the Pet Shop or something, I would be, I think, a little more into it.
I'm sorry, I cannot take that seriously.
I'm not wrong, though.
You are wrong.
No.
You are.
It's so on the nose.
That's fine.
A little cheesy.
I don't think so. I think it's fine. I mean, could you have a different title? Sure. But is this title going to detract from the story?
Yeah.
No. That's just you. That's all you.
That is not just me. No,
It is
no.
just you. It is just you.
No.
Yes.
Titles absolutely affect how people read stories.
Sure, and I don't think that this one, like, warrants that. Or not that level.
I said it made me not able to call it my favorite. I didn't say it made it a bad story.
Yeah, but I think that's too extreme.
Well, okay. We can agree to disagree there. It was sweet. I liked it.
It is a good story, regardless of your opinions on the title. I also really liked The Companionship of Lighthouses by Elizabeth Miles, which was very atmospheric.
That one was very atmospheric and also very touching. But, like, our characters have to fight to get there.
Yes.
It was
not
really
a bummer, but not a happy story.
Oh. I thought I had it. Well, I won't say I thought it had a happy ending, but, you know, the argument could maybe be made about some of the stories in this collection that will remain unnamed.
I don't think it had a sad ending, but I don't think it had a happy ending.
Oh, I do.
They're going to separate at some point.
That's okay.
Not a happy ending.
I don't think a relationship has to be permanent for it to be good.
I'm not saying it wasn't good. I'm just saying ending. I don't think it was a happy ending.
She was lonely, now she's not. That's fine.
And he's going to leave her one day and she's going to be lonely again. But it was a lovely story. Even though there was a lot of action at points, it felt very quiet.
It did. And if we're getting into it, I did not interpret the ending as he was planning on leaving her. I thought that was him saying, yes, I'll stay with you.
I didn't think it was him saying, yes, he would stay.
Well, ambiguous.
I thought it was him saying, I'm not going to push you to come with me.
Yeah, no, that's not how I read it.
Interesting.
Yeah. Maybe I was just so ready for something happy.
Maybe I was so primed by previous stories that I was expecting something on the sadder scale.
Yeah. Well, it has a good title, so this one's a good one. And that's what I have to say about that.
That is not the definition of a good story, but it does have a good title.
I think this as a collection was so kind of perfect for us in particular, because the works were like the perfect balance of familiar authors and new authors. I had like a really nice reading experience, running into people whose work I was familiar with and kind of knew what to expect from it, and also being introduced to entirely new authors at the same time. It was like a really lovely balance of having my cake and eating it too, aka more Stark Holborn stories, and getting ready to Google Wren Hutchings after the recording and find out everything they've ever written.
I agree. I did really like the mix of authors, and it was fun to discover new authors as well as discover works by authors that I'd heard of but hadn't gotten around to reading yet, like Jonathan L. Howard. So it was a really good mix of stories, and I think a good balance of fantasy versus science fiction versus horror versus bummer versus not bummer.
I would agree with that too. We had some stories set very similar to our world, some set as far from our world as you can get. And it was fun. It was a really nice, sampling of speculative fiction. I'll use the word.
Yeah. It's a good anthology.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Fiction Fans.
Come disagree with us. We're on Blue Sky and Instagram at FictionFansPod. You can also email us at fictionfanspod@gmail.com or leave a comment on our YouTube video.
If you enjoyed the episode, please rate and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and follow us wherever your podcasts live.
We also have a Patreon where you can support us and find exclusive episodes and a lot of other nonsense.
Thanks again for listening, and may your villains always be defeated. Bye!
Bye.